It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
I think it's really important that parents are talking to kids generally about different stages of life and what society expects from them.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
While not explicit, some of the things that we're going to be talking about in today's podcast are for mature ears, and there may be some people who may be triggered by some of the conversation that we'll be having in the podcast today. So if you have sensitive ears or little ears who are listening, this might be one to either skip or listen to at a different time. We're talking about a very challenging and very important topic today. This is Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm the founder of happyfamilies.com.au, and I'm really appreciative that you're joining me on the Happy Families podcast today. Unfortunately, Kylie couldn't be with me, but in response to a listener question that we had on Facebook a couple of weeks ago, I've reached out to Miranda Bain. Miranda Bain is the Therapy Services Manager or Director at Act for Kids, a psychologist who works to help children and families who are going through some significant challenges. And she joins me today to talk about sibling sexual abuse. Miranda, thanks so much for being a part of the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin.
So we had a question come from a listener via Facebook a little while ago. I want to read the question to you. And once again, just a warning in case people didn't catch it at the beginning, we are going to be talking about some fairly sensitive issues today. The Facebook follower asked this question: can you please help me out with some advice as to how to address a situation that I'm sure a lot of parents, including myself, don't know how to address or don't do well? I'm pretty sure I walked into my kids experimenting, and experimenting is in inverted commas, experimenting with each other last night. They're sharing a room while we have family visiting. While I like to think I'm pretty open-minded and body positive, I can feel myself battling my conditioning that kids should not be touching each other in this way. So can you please do a post about it or bring it up on the podcast? How do I talk to my kids about it? Do I even bring it up? How do I do it in a way that doesn't make the exploration of their bodies shameful, but I also want them to understand the whole issue of consent and not touching other people if they don't want to be touched? This has created a really big and carefully worded series of responses from people who have been in this situation. Miranda, some people are saying, well, this is sibling sexual abuse. This could turn into some really scary things. Other people are saying it's just kids trying to, I don't know, play doctors and nurses and figure things out for themselves. In some ways, this could be a really simple conversation about kids experimenting and, like I said, playing doctors and nurses, but it also could be much more than that. Miranda, as somebody who works in such a privileged and challenging position as the Director of Therapy Services for Act for Kids, how would you respond if you were asked this question by a parent who is obviously concerned?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is good on you for seeking support and information about it, and your obvious intention to not shame or harm your child. One of the things that we do know is that there's a strong correlation between shame and lowered self-esteem as a result of the way that our sexuality can be interpreted by others. So I want to say that first. Good on you for reaching out and seeking information. But I guess that's the second point I would say is if someone came to me with that scenario, I would say, gosh, really need some more information. The writer said that the children were sharing a room because they were family visiting. But so I'm assuming they don't normally share a room. So some of the information that I would probably be interested in is, do they typically play well together? Are they a similar age? Is there a strong bond between them? Is there a nice rapport? What was the context? So you say you've got family staying. Was that, are there big changes in the family? Were there family issues going on? I guess also thinking about what are the household norms and rules for your household? And do you have conversations with kids about with your children about protective behaviors, so things like public and private body parts, safe and unsafe touching, safe people, talking about consent, do the kids know their body part names? Those sorts of things would help me to know, to then frame where I would go from that.
Miranda, so many important points already in what you've said. It's also worth highlighting, we don't know the age of these children. That wasn't shared in this particular email. So it does kind of complicate the picture depending on whether the kids are really, really young or whether they're somewhat older and do know better. And to the extent that they know better, do they really know exactly what it means? So Let's talk about this from a benign situation. Let's say that this is the first time it's ever happened. They're really young kids. It's a scenario where we just need to talk to them about protective behaviours, as you said, and about private versus public body parts and the way we touch and what consent is and those sorts of things. Where do we draw the line? So what are the scenarios where a simple conversation is going to be enough?
Well, I think where a simple conversation will be enough is where it's developmentally normal, where there's an obvious curiosity and exploration rather than a sexual gratification. That's that the child's seeking a sexual gratification, that it's sort of coming out of both children's mutual interest, that there's a mutual consent. Are they laughing and giggling? Are they being silly with it and having fun? Those are the scenarios where a simple conversation is likely to be enough in a context where those conversations happen naturally anyway, a bit like what I'm assuming happens with the writer of the question. I think the other thing too is that it's important to look at when you typically are managing a child's behavior and you redirect them to something else that you feel comfortable with them doing. Does that work in this situation? That's a really important thing to consider. This behavior, is it a one-off thing? Is it just the exploration that would be part of their sexual development, depending on their age and stage? And the most important thing is that there is no fear or power imbalance, that there's no violence or threats involved or forcing. So I guess that's where it isn't a simple conversation. And the other thing, and I'm conscious as I say this, that, parents are listening but I have to be frank. Kids do what they see often. So exposure to online content, what older kids might be doing, movies, the parents' own sexuality, and domestic violence is a huge factor in harmful sexual behavior amongst peers and siblings. So we have to name that as well. This isn't about blaming parents, but it is about parents understanding that how they interact, particularly around power, has a direct implication for how children may explore this in their own development.
Wow, so important. Now, I'm going to assume, based on what I've read in this, and I recognise those contextual factors that you've highlighted could steer this into a darker area, but I'm going to assume that most parents who will hear a scenario like that, they're thinking of kids between, let's say, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 years of age, are going to say the kids probably know better, but they're curious and they're exploring, they're experimenting, and that conversation that you've highlighted is probably enough. But I want to suggest as well that, and I'm curious about your response to this, would it be fair to say that kids who could be as old as 10, 11, maybe even 12 or 13 might still be experimenting in a non-devious kind of way, even though they know that they shouldn't be doing what they're doing? Like they know that it's wrong. They know that they'll get in trouble for doing it. Maybe there even is a slight power imbalance, but they're not doing it in a way where they're kind of going, I'm doing this for gratification. They're doing it because they're genuinely curious. They don't really get the ramifications of what they're doing. They don't know why it's wrong or how wrong it actually is. Am I sounding too much like an apologist for kids that are doing the wrong thing, or is that a reasonable position to hold?
Look, I think that, we do want to give kids the benefit of the doubt. And it's probably really important to say at this point too, Justin, that in the past, there was a bit of a tendency for professionals and society generally to apply labels such as perpetrator, sexual offender to young people. We do know that the age of criminal responsibility is a lot lower in Australia than in some other countries. However, so this is a factor. So the ages that you've just mentioned, they are ages where depending on the circumstances, the police may get involved, or certainly a report to Child Protection Services may be indicated, depending on what's happening. However, so that's important that kids, we don't want kids to be naive to doing something that they think is silly, or they're experimenting, but however, it could have major consequences for them. So if we think about shoplifting, for example, similar type of thing, they could end up in a juvenile diversion, or something could happen as a result of that that they are not expecting. So I think it's really important that parents are talking to kids generally about different stages of life and what society expects from them. In terms of what you were saying with, is it genuinely about curiosity? One of the things to consider too is the wider family context and the school context, and what's happening for that child or young person in terms of their developmental phase. And are there any cognitive delays or any other emotional delays which may be at play here as well, in terms of, as you suggest, that they may know that it's wrong but still be engaging in the behavior, either because they feel pressured, it feels good, or they're responding to some kind of other external situation that they've been aware of, such as, something that they've seen online. Kids do learn through exploring the world, and the consequences which come from that are often how we gauge and we reset and go, oh, okay, well, I won't do that again. Gosh. So I think that that's an important factor, but it's actually up to the adults in their lives to provide clear and consistent messaging about what is okay and what isn't. And so we also have to consider what we're role modeling in our adult relationships, particularly that involve sexual contact. I guess the other thing that is useful to consider is, what is the behavior communicating? So, for example, if we are clear about what's occurred, and of course your original writer's question, we don't know exactly what the experimenting was, but it's useful as a parent to explore with your child, have they seen images online of a sexual content or anything that's made them feel uncomfortable? If they have accessed pornography, how often are they doing that, and what kind of pornography are they looking at? Check in with yourself around what messages overtly or accidentally you might be giving them. I mean, we know lots of adult relationships today are very much about hookups and Tinder and sexting, and so it could be that the child's also been exposed to some adult behaviors, which they've then, they're trying to make sense of in their play. So think about that in terms of yourself as well, and do respond with your own curiosity. Be curious, not condemning, because that stuff is a great way to build trust with your children over time, and to normalize conversations, particularly things like masturbation. And we should be, of course, be talking about consent from an early age as well, and what that looks like. I think that children do get more and more curious about sex and relationships in the ages that you've mentioned. It is developmentally appropriate to have or want to have romantic relationships, to use sexual language and make jokes or discuss sexual acts with peers. Also to want more privacy. That's normal in that stage of sexual development for a child. The other thing is, as you said, the curiosity, looking for information about sex in books, online, or in the media. And this is where they may well be accidentally exposed to adult content that might be quite disturbing for them. Touching themselves or masturbating in private is also normative in this age range. But remember, it's uncommon for children in that sort of age group to display sexual behavior in a public place, or display adult-like sexual behavior, such as things like oral or genital sex. That's not normal part of sexual development in this age.
There is so much to unpack or highlight in what you've just said. I'm going to try to do like a 30-second summary, which doesn't do it justice, before we take a break and come back in a minute to talk about a couple of other things. What I'm hearing you say is that it's typical and normal development from a sexual and psychological point of view for kids to be curious and even to want to experiment. But we want to make sure that there's nothing going on in the environment that could provoke any predatory or harmful behavior, things like pornography, major disruptions in the home, domestic violence, those kinds of things. And I'm also, if I'm correct, what I'm hearing you say is that as kids get older, they may still have a desire to experiment, but they typically will experiment privately rather than bringing other people in. And once we start to have power imbalances, once we start to have sexual gratification seeking rather than experimentation, we might be starting to, we are starting to tread on some pretty dangerous territory. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yeah, I think it is. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's so much that we've still got to unpack. So after the break, we're going to talk about when things start to get serious, how we can avoid downplaying things, and how to understand what sibling sexual abuse is, and we're also going to talk about what we can do as parents to help our kids be protected from these kinds of challenges. That's right after the break.
It's the Happy Families Podcast.
Imagine a home where discipline got results without anyone having to feel bad or in trouble. The Do's and Don'ts of Discipline is a webinar to help parents set limits with love, compassion, and humanity. Find it now at happyfamilies.com.au/shop.
It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. Normally, we talk about things to make your family happier. Today, we're delving into the dark side a little bit and tackling one of the tough issues. We're talking about sibling sexual experimentation that can even in some cases lead to abuse. Miranda Bain from Act for Kids is joining me. Miranda acts currently as the Therapy Services Director for Act for Kids and has been in that role for some time now, and has shared a lot of thought-provoking ideas in terms of a scenario that was presented to us by somebody on Facebook who said, what do I do when I catch my kids sexually experimenting with one another? Now, there was limited information, so we're kind of guessing about a fair bit of this. But Miranda, let's carry on this conversation now. Sibling sexual abuse, it's a reality. It happens. It might be tempting sometimes for parents to downplay it and think that it's just kids experimenting. How do we know? Where do we draw that line between experimentation and abuse? And how common is sibling sexual abuse? Let's talk about that. What predicts it? Where does it come from? How do we keep our kids safe from it? I'd love for you to just share for the next few minutes everything you can about this particular area.
It's difficult to have specific research that relates to sibling abuse, Justin, because of the secrecy around this particular issue. We do have parents who don't necessarily come forward and seek support. Children don't always disclose. What we do know is that sibling sexual abuse is very prevalent in harmful sexual behavior generally. So sometimes what can happen is it can start with peers and then end up coming into the home, or vice versa, because we do know that children are usually opportunistic. It's about a situation. Things can happen spontaneously. So access to siblings is, if one's considering experimentation, that's how that can arise. 1 in 4 children in Australia, in terms of our recent research, who are sexually abused, it is by a peer. So we know that a significant amount of harmful sexual behavior or abuse does occur between kids, and that's actually probably more likely than from a stranger, for example. So I think that's a really important message. We do know as well that there are some kind of common characteristics that happen for adults who abuse siblings and also friends or peers. But there are some differences that I have been able to find for you in this, and that's that sibling rivalry is a factor in sibling abuse, sexual abuse, where it is more in that harmful sexual behavior or concerning aspect of things. So sibling rivalry and power imbalances, as we described before, those are factors in sibling abuse. And also as we've again touched on before, family dysfunction, a chaotic sort of household, and exposure to violence is a common factor. We do know, as I said before, that usually the selection of who the targeted child is usually opportunistic, and as I said, kids are together, they're at home, sometimes they are sharing rooms, but we also know that a lot of the behavior that can occur between kids is guided through their experience of witnessing online content, or learning it from friends. So we found that about 78% of kids who were engaging in harmful sexual behavior had been prompted as a result of looking at sexually explicit materials online, and a further 72% who were engaging in the behavior also found that they were learning about it from friends. So, you learn about things in school, and then you potentially are bringing that home.
Yeah, they're extraordinary numbers. I mean, that's a really high number of kids that are being influenced in that way, which goes back to that conversation we had about 2 weeks ago. I think it was Tuesday 2 weeks ago with Kristen Jensen from Defend Young Minds about how important it is to have conversations about explicit imagery, about pornography with our kids. Just as I'm listening to you go through these stats, I'm curious, and I have my suspicions, but have you found that there's a gender difference? Males more likely to be involved in causing harm in this way than females?
It's really an interesting question, isn't it? I have anecdotally my understanding from the services that we provide and some recent discussions that I had with staff who work in the field of child sexual abuse and also harmful sexual behavior treatment, that under 10, it's often common for girl children to be the instigators. Over 10, it's more common, and with adolescents, for a boy to be the instigator of the activity or the abuse, if it's abuse. So yeah, there's a little bit of stuff there. It's certainly our statistics are hard because probably more males are taken through the juvenile justice system, and there's harder consequences that would come through. I would perhaps, wonder if when it is girls or if it's two girls together, whether it may not be treated in quite the same way as a boy with a girl or boy and boy. I think that there's often not trivializing, but sometimes people relate to female sexuality in a different way than they do male sexuality. Yeah,
I have no doubt that there would be some sort of a minimizing of it if it were girls. That seems to be a socio-cultural response to female sexuality across the board. That also strikes me as interesting from the point of view that when we look at research, not that we've got great research on it, it's still so hard to get good data, but it seems that boys tend to, on average, be exposed, whether intentionally or unintentionally, they tend to be exposed to pornography around about the age of 10 to 11. And it's curious, we've got testosterone kicking in, we've got increased interest in sexuality. That's where the pornography comes in. And we've got reasonable evidence now that porn really does harm kids. It changes their beliefs about sex and sexuality and intimacy. And once you change somebody's beliefs, you're quite likely to change their behaviours. So everything that you've said there kind of sits within that broader landscape of what our kids are being exposed to and highlights how important it is that we protect them. Maybe we can wrap up the conversation with just a handful of tips. What can parents do? The idea is that people don't assault others, right? The idea is that we stop those who are committing acts of abuse, whether intentionally or out of experimentation. We stop them from doing that, but we know that we don't live in a perfect world, and we want to help our kids to be protected and to defend themselves if they encounter somebody who might try to act on them in this way. So I want to be sensitive around asking that question, because really it shouldn't be up to the kids to protect themselves. Nevertheless, because of the world we live in, every parent wants to know, how can I keep my kids safe? What would be your general tips, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 tips to help parents to navigate this with their children sensitively and in age-appropriate ways?
Sure. And yes, it is very much the case that adults need to take responsibility for protecting children, and that part of that is actually teaching kids that it's okay to speak up for themselves, and that when they do share something that's a worry to them, that they'll be believed, that they'll be reassured that that adult will do their best to help and support, to address whatever that might be. And I guess the other thing too is that just to reassure folks that it is really about listening. So sometimes we think as parents it's about teaching and telling and having all the answers. Actually, with guiding your child through their healthy sexual development, it's actually very much about listening and taking cues from them. So we want to consider things like early protective behavior training. And this is, we know even through research that Act for Kids has done that parents do believe that probably after age 5 that protective behavior training should occur and kids should know body part names and that sort of thing as they're entering school. However, we believe that actually kids do need to know younger than that age, and even naming the parts when you're changing a nappy or helping with toileting is a really useful thing. And the other thing to really remember is it's so important that kids know the accurate body part names. So, we don't call an elbow something random, we call it an elbow. So it's really important that we're using the proper names for genitalia and that kids know those names from an early age. Even if you have other silly names you use for other things, it is important that they know the proper names.
So Miranda, I've got to jump in here as well, because something that I've been corrected on, and I think that is right, is, and I'm speaking specifically about female anatomy here, the area surrounding the vagina is called the labia. We shouldn't call the entire area the vagina, because if a child does encounter somebody who inappropriately touches them, they need to be able to say what has been touched, and having that level of knowledge, helping them to understand that anatomical difference between labia and vagina is a really important difference.
Look, I probably would use the term vulva to describe the female genitalia as an entirety. The labia are normally considered to be the external part. Then you've got the clitoris and the vagina, and it is really, you're so right there. The vagina is important if we're talking about any kind of penetrative things that have occurred. Obviously, girls need to know about their vagina for things like menstruation. That's so important for them, as well as, of course, reproductive health. But you're right. The vagina is simply an opening into the body, but we would typically, in our work, refer to it as the vulva. And the penis, of course, but it's good for boys to also know that they have testicles and, the other bits of their body. So I guess that's where we can go to, some of those old school books and kind of show children what they have. And depending on how, how normal nudity is in your household, it may well be that your children have seen you naked and that's okay in your household. That's, I guess, one of the things that I think is important to consider when you are wanting to keep your kids safe is think about what your culture is in the home and whether or not you would feel just as comfortable with a child being exposed to your cultural norms in somebody else's home. So, for example, we want to raise children to be healthy, functional, safe adults and young people. So when kids start going on sleepovers and things, you wouldn't, one presumes, walk around with just a towel or nude going from the bathroom to the bedroom to get dressed if there was a child's friend over. So I guess it's important for adults to remember that kids don't necessarily pick up on the nuances. So, if it's normally this that, Dad, I'm just being very general here. Dad comes home from rugby practice and jumps in the shower and then, runs to the bedroom and puts his clothes on. But there might be, a shot of a bum if you looked up. That might be normal in that household and completely fine. But the child needs to understand that only would happen when it's just special, certain people in the house, and that it's not about inflicting that on someone else. So we do need to think about what's normal in your household and also consider as kids are developing, because privacy becomes a real thing for them, particularly in the age ranges we've mostly been talking about today. And so things like knocking on their doors, having conversations about bathrooms, who's allowed in the bathroom when you are showering, who's allowed in the bathroom when you're going to the toilet. Those are the things that in some households, there may be blurred boundaries around that. And so it's really good to name that so that the child doesn't go into someone else's house and actually, feel mortified because they've done something and been pulled up by, their friend's parent or being embarrassed by the friend's reaction. So that's one of the, I almost call it like a duty of care that we have to make sure that our rules at home are not random and very different from what they might expect out there. So in terms of what you're saying, yes, kids need to know their anatomical names for their body parts. They also need to know what's public and private. So we can generally, in our work, we talk about public being bits that you see when people have clothes on, or given we're in Australia and lots of folks go to the beach and swimming, thinking about the private parts are what's typically covered by your swimming costume, but also to consider touching. So what parts are okay and not okay to be touched by someone else, and in what context. That's really important. And it's important, I guess, to be hearing from your child who they think those safe people might be, or in what context. And it's also really important to be identifying with them that they have the right to say no to someone touching with them, and talking about consent early. So there could be, it could be that you always have to kind of notice that the child doesn't really want to hug a particular relation who comes. Now, it might be because they don't really like hugging generally, or it might be this particular relative is not appealing to them to hug. They need to have the right to say no. They need to explore other options of greeting that person, high fives, fist bumps, whatever it might be, that's still acknowledging that relationship, but doesn't mean that they have to be hugged. We shouldn't be forcing kids to be hugged by other people. I know that some of your listeners will probably think that that's a bit over the top, but I think that it is important, because if we're forcing someone to sit on Santa's knee, if we're forcing someone to hug, grandpa, we need to have kids understand that when they feel like something's not right in their belly or in their, anywhere else where they feel concerned, that they can act on that and they can say no, and that's going to be respected. And if we don't actually model that at home and respect that, then we've got, how on earth can we expect them to stick to their guns out in the real, out in the bigger world, particularly as it comes to dating and other relationships. The other thing that's really important that we talk to kids about is safe and unsafe secrets. So, there's secrets like, oh, we're keeping it a secret that we're having a surprise party for Auntie and it's going to be at our house. That's super cool and that's fun, but that's actually almost like a surprise. So it's a special secret that we're keeping because it's about keeping the surprise from Auntie because she's going to have a fun time at her birthday. That's really different to someone using tactics which might involve threat, for example, and saying, well, if you don't, I'm going to touch your willy, and if you tell anyone, I'm going to do something horrible to your family or hurt your dog or if it's a sibling, they might say, I'm gonna ruin your favorite toy and throw it out the window, or, so those sorts of things. So a child may sometimes keep a secret out of fear, and that's quite different to keeping a secret out of excitement.
Miranda, as we've had this conversation, there are obviously so many different pathways that we could go to explore to get more information. Unfortunately, time is going to beat us here. Any last thoughts, any other points that people should be aware of, any resources that you might direct people to so that they can help their children to be safe?
Yes, it is a big topic, and I appreciate, that we have very little time to kind of dip our toes in. I think, yes, it's really important to have protective behaviour training. A number of schools in Queensland are offering that through a range of modalities. Act for Kids has a program which is a gold standard evidence-based protective behaviours program for young children, and that's you can read about that on our website. There's certainly some great materials on True's website. So folks may know of them as Family Planning Queensland. They've got some excellent resources on typical development for children and ways to encourage protective behaviours. Similarly, well, there's a number of agencies that do that, and certainly if you do Google it, you'll come up with a lot of options, but I would encourage you to go to reputable agencies and look at their websites first. Australian Childhood Foundation is another great example with great resources. The other thing to consider that I do think is really important is that if your child is engaging in a behaviour and you do need to do something about it, reach out for help, because we do know, and this is just to reassure parents, the absolute majority of kids who engage in even harmful sexual behavior do not grow up to become pedophiles typically. That is not what the research shows. The research shows literally that sometimes some kids grow out of it and they just start engaging in normal dating type behavior. But we don't want to ignore it at the same time, because the reality is there was someone, if it is a harmful sexual behavior situation, there was a child who was victimized by that, who did feel coerced or controlled or violated and abused. And we can't neglect their reality too. So if you're talking about siblings and managing that, it's really important to consider their relationship and preserving their sibling relationship. We don't want to have things get swept under the carpet, or only one child receive support and the other one get banished to Siberia. That's no good for the family. And we really, again, know that the best work that's happening in this space at the moment is family-based work. It's environmental work that often, includes schools and other supports, and that you're part of a care team. And I guess the last message I would say is, please talk to your kids continuously and honestly and listen to them. That's probably a really important message.
Miranda Bain, the Director of Therapy Services for Act for Kids. An important conversation. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Justin. Have a great day.
The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. For all of the resources that Miranda has highlighted and others, you can check the show notes for today's podcast. I'm sure that you'll find that helpful. And if you'd like more info about keeping your family safe and making your family happy, visit us at happyfamilies.com.au.